I swear that dog spoke to me from inside the flames. That's what I said. Standing in the middle of the charred remains of the Wilmington house, soot streaked across my cheeks, still shaking from adrenaline. My name's Tom Carver, Station Chief of Ladder 9 in rural North Carolina. 23 years on the job, and I'd seen plenty of strange things. Cats hiding under floorboards, kids crawling into cupboards where no air should reach, even one guy holed up inside his own freezer to escape a blaze. But nothing like that dog. The call came in just before dawn. Single-story home on Timber Ridge Road. Kitchen fire, spreading fast. Dispatch said everyone had gotten out except for someone yelling about their dog. We rolled in, sirens screaming, tires crunching gravel. By the time we got there, the place was half engulfed. "Back corner bedroom," one of the neighbors shouted, pointing through the smoke. "The dog's in the back room." We don't leave anyone behind, not even the four-legged kind. I threw on my mask and gear and headed straight in. The smoke was thick, a dark soup you could almost chew. The kind of fire that breathes back at you, pushing heat out like it's alive. Furniture crackled. Beams groaned above me, but I kept going. I found him crouched under a bed, a golden retriever, his fur matted with ash, eyes wild but trusting. He didn't bark or growl, he just stared, like he was waiting for me. And here's the part no one believes. When I bent down and said, "Come on, buddy," I swear he looked me dead in the eye and said, clear as day, "Hurry." I blinked, thought the heat had cooked my brain. But he crawled out and nudged my arm, like he knew the roof had about 30 seconds left before it came down. We got out just in time. 2 seconds later, the entire ceiling collapsed behind us. "Dog's name is Scout," one of the family members told me later. "He's been with us 10 years. Scout wouldn't leave my side. Even after we returned him to his family, he kept slipping away and following me around the firehouse like I was his new human. Eventually, the family came by and said it was clear Scout had made his choice. They were moving in with relatives and couldn't take him anyway. Did I want to keep him? Now, I'm not the kind of guy who cries. But I teared up, right there in the station garage, helmet still in my hands. Of course I said yes. Scout moved in with me the next day, and within a week, it felt like he'd always been there. He had this way of knowing when I was headed out before the pager even went off. I'd reach for my boots, and he'd already be standing by the door, tail wagging. And when I came home bone-tired and silent, he'd nuzzle my hand and rest his head on my knee like he understood. Now that would have been enough to make him a hero in my book. But what happened a week later changed everything. It was a Sunday morning. Quiet. I was in the backyard fixing a busted hose line when Scout suddenly started barking like mad from inside the house. Not his usual bark, either. This was urgent. Scared. I dropped the wrench and ran in. He was in the living room, pacing, barking toward the hallway. And that's when I smelled it. Gas! I raced to the kitchen. The old oven line, I'd been meaning to replace it, had split. There was a faint hiss in the air, and the stink of gas was getting thicker by the second. If Scout hadn't barked, if he hadn't known something was wrong, I might have lit a cigarette out back and blown the place sky high. I shut off the valve, opened every window, and sat down hard on the front steps, heart pounding. He came over, sat beside me, and just looked at me with those big golden eyes. "You saved me, didn't you?" I whispered. He wagged his tail once. That's how it started. The bond. I don't even think bond is the right word. He became part of me, like he'd always been meant to show up exactly when he did. It wasn't just the gas leak. There were little things, too. The time I almost backed the engine into a low beam at the station and Scout barked like his tail was on fire. The moment he pulled me away from a collapsing garage during a call, right before the wall caved in. He was my shadow, my guardian. The guys at the station started calling him the Firehouse Prophet. Said he had a sixth sense, and maybe he did. There was this one night. We'd just come back from a brutal barn fire outside Hendersonville. Lost half a dozen goats, barely saved the farmer. I was wiped, emotionally fried. I sat on my porch, staring into nothing. Scout came up and dropped something at my feet. It was an old, half-burned glove from the fire earlier. I hadn't even noticed I lost it. I looked at him, and he looked back, tail swishing gently across the porch. "Thanks, partner," I said. He laid down beside me, his head on my boot. This was just the beginning. Scout wasn't just a good dog. He was something more. And the more time we spent together, the more I realized it. Then came the call that changed everything again. 3-alarm fire at an abandoned paper mill out near Green Hollow. Place had been shut down for years, but some squatters had taken shelter inside. Rumor was they'd lit a barrel fire that went out of control. By the time we arrived, the flames were chewing through the building like dry paper. We split up, searching for survivors. I took the west wing, Scout trailing behind. Yeah, I know. We're not supposed to take animals into active scenes, but try telling Scout that. He wasn't a dog anymore. He was part of the crew. We found 2 people unconscious in a stairwell, smoke rising fast. I radioed for backup, but it was chaos out there. Roof was ready to fall. I slung one guy over my shoulder, told Scout to stay. He didn't. He ran to the other man, teeth gently tugging at his sleeve. When I came back, he was still trying to drag him toward the exit. Together, we got them both out. Afterward, the chief gave me a look. "That dog just made a save." I nodded. "Yeah, he does that." Scout got his own turnout coat after that. One of the guys stitched his name on it. He'd wear it during calls, even had little boots for his paws. The town loved it. Kids would come by the station just to see him. He became our mascot, our miracle. But I knew. Deep down, I knew this was leading somewhere. Because dogs like Scout don't just show up for nothing. There's more to tell. A lot more. Like what happened on Christmas Eve, when a snowstorm knocked out power across half the county, and Scout went missing for 5 hours. Or the time he led us to a boy trapped in an old grain silo. I'm not a superstitious man, but I'll say this. If angels walk among us, some of them have 4 legs and a tail. And Scout? He might just be one of them, because the day he saved me for the second time, really saved me, was the day I finally understood why he'd come into my life at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how it all unfolded. Christmas Eve started with a hush. That rare, peaceful kind of silence you get only once in a while in a firefighter's life. Snow had begun falling sometime around midnight, blanketing our little town of Franklin Hollow like a fresh sheet. The roads were empty. The air was sharp and clean. And for a moment, it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. Scout had been restless that morning. He kept pacing near the front window, ears perked, tail stiff. I figured it was the snow or maybe the kids sledding down the hill across the street. But when I opened the door to let him out, he didn't bolt for the yard like usual. He just stood there, nose in the air, sniffing like something wasn't right. "Snow smells funny, huh?" I joked. He looked back at me and gave a soft, low whine. I'd learned by then not to ignore Scout's instincts. An hour later, the power went out. I was in the garage tinkering with the space heater when everything clicked off. The radio, the lights, the hum of the old fridge. Even the backup generator in the shed didn't kick in. Scout barked once, sharp and quick, then dashed to the back door. I followed him out into a blur of white. The wind had picked up, snow swirling like flour in a storm. Scout was already halfway down the driveway, heading toward the station, which sat just 4 blocks away. I grabbed my coat and ran after him. The station was dark, too. No backup power, no radio traffic. That alone was enough to make my heart pound. The emergency lines ran through a separate grid, shielded and reinforced. If they were down, this wasn't just a snowstorm, it was something bigger. Inside, the rest of the crew was already gathering. Charlie, my second in command, was on the phone trying to reach dispatch through a backup cell. Jake was flipping through channels on the portable radio. Nothing but static. "We're blind," Charlie said, shaking his head. "Phones are down countywide. Radio's useless. Some kind of freak grid collapse. Substation fire, maybe?" I turned to Scout. He was pacing again, ears twitching. Then he stopped cold, nose pointed east, toward the hills. "What is it, boy?" I asked. He barked once, and then again, louder. "Maybe it's nothing," Jake said. "Just a dog being a dog." But I knew better. Scout took off through the snow, tail high, and I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear and followed, yelling for Jake and Charlie to cover the station. The snow was ankle deep, winds howling now. I followed Scout east through backyards and alleys, past shuttered storefronts and snow-covered swings, until we reached the edge of the woods. He paused once, glanced back to make sure I was still behind him, then plunged into the trees. I stumbled through the snow, lungs burning. We must have gone nearly a mile before I heard it, faint at first, but clear. A child's cry. "Help!" I froze. "Scout, you hear that?" He barked again and veered left. We found her near the old creek, huddled beneath a collapsed wooden bridge. A little girl, no older than 7, wrapped in a thin pink jacket, cheeks red and raw from the cold. I dropped to my knees beside her. "Hey there, sweetheart. My name's Tom. You okay?" She nodded weakly, teeth chattering. "Scout found you. That's a good sign." I scooped her up gently, wrapping my coat around her. Scout stayed close, tail wagging slowly, eyes watchful. On the way back, she told me her name, Emma. She'd been sledding with her older brother when he wiped out and went looking for help. She'd wandered too far trying to find him. Her family had called 911, but with the lines down, no one ever got through. Back at the station, we bundled her in blankets and radioed for an ambulance the old-fashioned way by driving to the nearest open firehouse 20 miles away. Emma recovered just fine. Her parents came the next day with a box of donuts and more tears than I've ever seen outside a wedding. Scout got a whole dozen glazed to himself. But the real trouble started that night. I woke to the sound of Scout whining. Not barking, not pacing. Whining. A deep, urgent, mournful sound coming from the hallway. I found him sitting beside my bed, head tilted, eyes locked on the door. "What is it, buddy?" He stood and walked to the front window. I looked outside. The sky had turned orange. I threw on my gear, no time to think. The whole block behind us was lit up. A house, maybe 2, was on fire, flames licking the sky, smoke billowing fast in the wind. I radioed the crew, but the lines were still down. I had no choice. I grabbed my keys and Scout and bolted for the truck. By the time we reached the scene, half the neighborhood was awake. Some folks were trying to douse the flames with garden hoses, slipping and falling in the snow. Kids were crying. One woman kept screaming a name over and over. "Frankie! Frankie! Who's inside?" I yelled. "My husband!" she shouted. "He went back in for the dog." The flames had reached the 2nd floor. The house groaned under the pressure, windows popping, wood cracking. I knew the layout. It was a Cape Cod with narrow stairs and a back exit through the kitchen. I turned to Scout. "You ready?" He didn't wait. He was already halfway up the porch before I caught up. Inside, the heat hit us like a wall. I ducked low. Mask on. Scout close. We swept the first floor fast. Nothing. Then I heard it. A bark, faint but steady, from upstairs. "Scout!" I pointed. "Up!" He bounded up the stairs ahead of me. We found the man in the master bedroom, hunched over a Labrador, trying to drag it toward the door. "I got him!" I shouted. "Grab the dog!" Together, we hauled them out, Scout barking non-stop as if urging us to move faster. Seconds after we hit the front yard, the roof caved in. Frankie looked up at me, his face covered in soot, eyes wide. "That dog, he led you straight to me." I nodded, panting. "Yeah, he does that." After that, the town knew. Scout wasn't just a mascot, he was a miracle. We started getting calls, not emergencies, just folks wanting Scout to visit. A boy with leukemia, an old man who'd lost his wife, a woman battling depression. Scout would sit with them, tail thumping, eyes soft. Sometimes he'd rest his head on their knee. Sometimes he'd just lay down beside them, like he knew exactly what they needed. And somehow, every time, they felt better. But with the attention came the scrutiny. A reporter showed up one day from Raleigh, asking questions, sniffing around for a story. "What's the deal with the dog?" she asked. "Some people say he's got, a gift." I shrugged. "He's just a dog. A really good dog." She wasn't buying it, asked to follow us on a call. I said no. She left, but I had a feeling we hadn't seen the last of her. Scout didn't care about fame. He just wanted to ride in the truck, eat his kibble, and curl up at my feet after a long shift. One night, a fire broke out at the local animal shelter. Scout went berserk before the alarm even rang. Woke me from a dead sleep, teeth tugging my sleeve. We were the first on the scene. There were dozens of animals trapped inside, smoke pouring from the vents, windows blown out. The staff had gotten most of them out, but one kennel in the back was still full. I wasn't sure we could get to them in time. Then Scout took off. I chased after him, yelling, but he didn't stop. He led me through a side entrance I hadn't noticed before, an old maintenance door. It was jammed, but I busted it open with a crowbar. Inside, the heat was brutal, smoke thick. But the kennel was right there. We got them all out. 12 dogs, 4 cats, and 1 very grumpy parrot. The shelter staff called Scout a guardian angel, said they were going to hang his picture in the lobby. I just scratched behind his ears and gave him a bite of my sandwich. And then, just when I thought things might calm down, Scout disappeared. It was 3 days after New Year's. I'd come back from a routine inspection and found the front door wide open, his leash still on the hook, food untouched. I called for him, drove the neighborhood, checked the station, the park, even the old lumber yard he liked to sniff around. Nothing. The town mobilized, flyers went up, volunteers searched day and night. Someone even offered a reward. 3 days passed. Then 4. Then a week. And just when I thought I couldn't take the silence anymore, the phone rang. It was a boy, voice trembling. "Mister, I think I found your dog. Mister, I think I found your dog." The voice on the other end was shaky, like the kid was scared even to speak. I snapped upright, the chair in my kitchen clattering behind me. It was just after 6 in the morning, and I hadn't slept a full night since Scout disappeared. "Where are you?" I asked, gripping the phone tight. "I'm at the edge of Willow Creek Trail," the boy said, "by the old ranger station." That was 6 miles out of town. "I think he's hurt," the kid added. "He won't get up." I didn't even stop to lace my boots. I grabbed my jacket, keys, and first aid kit and was out the door in less than a minute. The snow had mostly melted after the warm spell, but the trail leading out to the ranger station was still icy in patches. My truck skidded twice, and I nearly ditched it before deciding to hike the last half-mile. I spotted the boy first, a lanky teenager in a red hoodie, standing near the tree line, looking pale and unsure. He pointed down toward a hollow behind the old station. "He's down there," he said quietly. I heard barking when I was walking my dog. I followed it and found him lying in the brush. I didn't wait for more. I scrambled down the hill, boots sliding on loose dirt, and then I saw him. Scout. He was lying on his side, his coat matted and dirty, a long scrape down one flank. His right front leg was twisted under him at an odd angle, and he was panting hard. But when he saw me, his tail gave a feeble thump. "Oh, buddy," I breathed, dropping beside him. "What happened to you?" I checked him over as best I could. No blood from the mouth, no signs of internal bleeding. His leg was definitely broken, but he was alert. That tail kept wagging, slow but steady. "We're gonna get you out of here," I whispered. "Hang on." I carried him up the hill in my arms, which wasn't easy. Scout was no lightweight, but adrenaline had a way of lending strength when you needed it most. The boy helped me clear a path back to the truck, holding doors, running ahead. I didn't even catch his name. We drove straight to Dr. Harris, the town vet. She had the doors open before I parked, having already gotten the heads up from the sheriff's office. They'd heard my panicked call go out over the emergency band I'd borrowed from the station. Dr. Harris and her team worked fast, and I sat in the waiting room for what felt like an eternity. When she finally came out, she had a tired smile on her face. "He's gonna be okay, Tom. It's a clean break in the foreleg, a few scrapes, and he's dehydrated. But he's tough. He'll pull through." I nearly collapsed from the relief. Scout spent the next few days in recovery, with me visiting every hour I could. Dr. Harris let me sleep on the bench in the exam room one night, after she caught me dozing off in the lobby. Scout would rest his head against my side and let out these soft little sighs, like he was trying to tell me it was all going to be all right. By the end of the week, he was cleared to come home, with strict orders for rest, minimal walking, and no stairs. I set up a makeshift bed for him in the living room, laid out fresh blankets, and brought his food and water bowls right to his side. Scout being home changed the energy of the place instantly. It felt alive again. The silence that had hung in every room lifted like a curtain, and even the guys at the station started smiling more. They brought him treats, toys, even a ridiculous red sweater someone had knitted. And through it all, Scout healed. Slowly but surely. A week later, he was hobbling on 3 legs. 2 weeks after that, he was bearing weight on the injured one. By the end of the month, he was back to his usual self, though a little slower, a little stiffer. We tried to ease him back into his routine. I'd take him for short walks to the station, and the guys would all come out to greet him. Kids dropped off cards and drawings with big letters that said things like, "We love you, Scout," and "Hero Dog Forever." But something in Scout had changed. He was still him. Sweet, loyal, sharp as ever. But now he was more watchful, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. He would sit near the front window for hours, staring toward the woods. He'd perk up when the wind changed direction. At night, he'd sometimes whimper in his sleep, legs twitching like he was dreaming of running. And that's when the calls started again. They were different now, not just fires or emergencies. People were calling the station asking for Scout. "Could he come visit my grandfather? He's in hospice and hasn't spoken in days." "My son had surgery. He only smiles when Scout's around." I know it's a long shot, but my husband just came home from deployment and he's struggling. Could Scout stop by? We couldn't say yes to everyone, but we tried. On slow days, we'd pile into the old Ford and make the rounds. Scout would ride shotgun, head out the window, tail wagging, and he'd sit with those people. No tricks, no fancy moves, just sit beside them like he was listening. And somehow, they felt seen, comforted, heard. I started keeping a notebook, writing down the visits, the people he helped, the things they said afterward. He looked right into my soul. I haven't felt calm like that in years. Your dog made me believe in something again. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't. But I kept writing. Then came the parade. Every year, Franklin Hollow held a Founders' Day parade, a humble little affair with tractors, marching bands, and paper streamers. That year, the mayor insisted we put Scout on the lead float. We built a little fire truck replica out of plywood, painted it red, and added flashing lights. Scout rode on top in his turnout coat, the one with his name stitched across the back. The crowd went wild. He barked once every few feet, tail wagging like crazy. Kids shouted his name. Parents clapped, even the grumpy sheriff, who hated parades, tipped his hat. That night, back at the house, I scratched behind his ears and said, "You know you're the biggest celebrity in town, right?" He let out a happy sigh and curled up at my feet. I thought maybe we'd finally found a rhythm again. But life has a funny way of shifting just when you settle in. It was early spring when we got the call about the overturned school bus. Scout was sleeping beside my locker when the alarm blared. He jolted up, ears perked, already alert before the details even came through. We were out the door in seconds. The bus had skidded off the icy road near Sycamore Ridge, landing halfway down a slope, its wheels barely visible through the trees. We got there fast, but the scene was chaos. Kids crying, the driver unconscious, one wheel still spinning. We jumped into action. I assigned crews to each side, started organizing triage. Then Scout barked, loud, urgent. He took off toward the woods. "Scout!" I shouted, but he was already weaving through the trees. Jake ran up beside me. "Should we go after him?" I hesitated. Something in my gut said yes. We followed the path Scout had carved and found her, a girl, no older than 10, who'd been thrown from the bus and landed in a ditch, hidden by underbrush. She was unconscious, bleeding from a cut on her forehead. If Scout hadn't found her, she might have been left behind entirely. After that, no one questioned his instincts again. He became our unofficial search dog. The county sheriff signed off on it. Even the fire chief downtown approved it. We started training him formally. Me, Jake, Charlie, and a retired canine handler named Russ. It turned out Scout was a natural. He took to tracking like he'd been born for it. And still, every time, he'd look at me like he already knew where to go. One afternoon, during a search drill, Russ turned to me and said, "Tom, I've trained dogs for 30 years. Seen some amazing ones. But this guy? He's something else." I nodded. "I know." Russ studied Scout for a moment. "You ever think he's, I don't know, more than just a dog?" "All the time," I said. There's still more to this story. I haven't even told you about the chemical spill at the mill, or the lightning strike at the old church, or the boy who ran away from home and wouldn't talk to anyone but Scout. This isn't the kind of tale that fits neatly in a box. It doesn't tie itself up with a ribbon, because Scout keeps doing things that surprise me, things that make me stop and wonder how in the world I got so lucky, the way he showed up when he did, the way he always seems to know, the way he keeps giving, day after day. and I have a feeling we're just getting started. If you had told me a year ago that a dog would become the soul of our entire town, I'd have laughed it off. Dogs were loyal, sure. Smart? Absolutely. But a soul? That was something else. Yet every time I looked at Scout, especially after the school bus rescue, I knew I was looking at something far bigger than loyalty. Bigger than smarts, even. There was something in his eyes that said, "I see more than you do. Just trust me." We did trust him. All of us. Without question. Scout wasn't just part of the Franklin Hollow Fire Department anymore. He was part of Franklin Hollow itself. You couldn't walk down Main Street without someone waving at him or offering a treat from their pocket. Businesses hung pictures of him in their windows. One local bakery even made bone-shaped cookies with his face on them. Well, sort of. The frosting blob looked more like a rabbit than a retriever, but it was the thought that counted. There was a warmth in town that hadn't been there before. People lingered longer in the diner. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shared stories about the fires Scout helped at, or the people he'd comforted. Kids started bringing their own dogs to the station just to let them meet him. It became a tradition. If Scout sniffed your dog and wagged his tail, it meant you were doing something right. But peace has a way of sitting too long. And something was coming. You could feel it in the air. It started with a strange call one Wednesday afternoon. Not an emergency. Not exactly. A woman named Carol, in her 70s, lived alone on the outskirts of town. Her late husband had built their cabin by hand, and she'd refused to leave it even after he passed. She called the station because, in her words, "Something's wrong with the air." Charlie took the call, wrote it off as someone feeling lonely or confused. But Scout didn't. The moment Carol's name came through the speaker, Scout barked. Not his usual bark. It was short and sharp, like he was trying to get our attention. Jake raised an eyebrow. "You think he knows something?" "Has he ever been wrong?" I asked. We loaded up and headed to her property. The drive out took us past the edge of the woods, through narrow gravel roads and creaking bridges that hadn't been maintained in years. Carol met us at the front porch. She looked tired, her face pale, hands shaking slightly. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know I sound like a crazy old bat." "Not at all," I said. "You said the air felt wrong?" She nodded. "It's heavy. Hard to breathe sometimes. And there's a smell, like rotten eggs, but metallic?" Scout paced in a tight circle at my feet. His tail was low, ears twitching. I stepped inside the cabin. It was warm, too warm for spring. I checked the fireplace, the vents, everything I could think of. Then I noticed the crack in the basement floor. It wasn't wide, but there was a strange hiss coming from it. I got close and caught it, the smell Carol mentioned, not sulfur, gas. We evacuated her immediately, got the county engineers on site the next morning. Turns out an old sealed line had ruptured beneath her home. The gas hadn't fully leaked yet, but it was close. One more spark, and her cabin would have gone up like a bonfire. Scout wouldn't leave her side while we worked. He laid his head on her knee as she watched her home being inspected. She just kept whispering, "Thank you. Thank you." Later that week, Carol came by the station with 2 pies and a hand-knitted blanket for Scout. She called him her angel. The next few weeks brought more strange calls. Not disasters, just oddities. A gas leak at the middle school, discovered just hours before classes resumed. An unstable power pole behind the grocery store that sparked and hissed whenever the wind picked up. A faulty fuse box at the nursing home where one of the residents swore he saw a golden dog standing outside his door just before the fire alarm went off. Each time, Scout was there. Each time, He led us to the problem before it could get worse. We started calling these saves Scout Alerts. The mayor even used the term in a town council meeting. But with every save, Scout seemed more tired. He was still happy, still eager, but there were moments, quiet, fleeting, where he would just sit and stare at something invisible, like he was waiting. One morning I found him on the porch, eyes locked on the horizon. The sky was clear, the birds were chirping. But Scout wasn't moving. "You see something?" I asked. He didn't even look at me. 2 days later, the fire started. It began in the north woods, deep enough that no one noticed right away. A group of campers had left a fire smoldering under dry leaves. By the time someone saw the smoke, the wind had already carried it a mile. Scout was the first to notice. He woke me before dawn, pacing, barking, pulling at my sleeve. When I stepped outside, I saw it, the dark plume rising just above the treetops. We were on it fast, faster than we'd ever been. Every station within 50 miles joined in. Helicopters, brush trucks, volunteers. It was the biggest fire our county had seen in over 2 decades. And Scout was there the whole time. He rode with us to the front lines, staying clear of the heat, but alert, always alert. He found 2 hikers trapped near a dry creek bed, their phones dead, their path blocked. He barked until one of our teams heard him and led them out. On the second day, a volunteer got separated from his crew. Scout tracked him through 2 miles of scorched earth, over collapsed trees and ash-filled gullies. When we found them, the man was dehydrated and shaken, but alive. But fires take more than they give. By the end of the 4th day, over 200 acres had burned. Dozens of homes were evacuated. No lives lost, but plenty of livelihoods disrupted. On the 5th night, Scout didn't sleep. He sat by the truck, watching the trees. I sat next to him, silence between us. "You know this isn't the last one, don't you?" I said quietly. He leaned into me. The next morning, the fire was mostly contained. Crews started pulling back. Roads reopened. The town breathed again. And just like that, Scout was ready to go. Back to his rounds. Back to watching, listening, protecting. There was no end to what he did. No final moment of glory. Because he wasn't in this for fame. He didn't want a medal or a headline. He just wanted to be there when someone needed him. And every time he was, something in this world got a little better. I didn't always understand how he knew. Maybe no one ever will. But Scout's story wasn't slowing down. Not even close. There were more calls ahead. More people to help. More lives to touch. Because that's what Scout did. He showed up, again and again. And he never once asked why. You ever watch a dog run into danger without hesitation and realize he's not doing it out of instinct, but choice? That was the thought rolling through my mind the morning Scout and I were sent to Riverview. It had been a month since the forest fire. Scout had returned to his normal self, or close to it. He still moved a bit slower, and sometimes his eyes carried the weight of something far away, but his tail wagged just the same when he saw kids outside the firehouse, or when the crew showed up with breakfast sandwiches. He was back on patrol, back to checking the wind through the kitchen window, back to curling up beside my boots every evening. The call came in just after sunrise. A residential gas line explosion in Riverview, the next town over. Mutual aid was already in effect, and we were requested by name. Me and Scout specifically. I didn't ask who requested us. I just packed our gear and loaded up the truck. When we pulled in, the street was chaos. Smoke poured from 2 houses that had been reduced to smoldering frames. Fire crews were already working to contain the flames, but there were reports of missing residents. One of the local captains flagged me down. "Tom, glad you came. We've got 4 unaccounted for. 2 adults, 2 kids. House at the far end, number 12. Scout was already out of the truck, nose in the air, tail stiff. He didn't wait. He darted toward the wreckage, weaving between hoses and debris. "Let him work," I told the captain. We followed Scout to the shell of the house. The front porch had collapsed, and most of the roof was gone. I crouched by the edge of the wreckage and watched as Scout sniffed the air, circled, then stopped. He barked once, then twice, sharp, focused. "That's it," I said. "They're in there." The crew moved fast. We cleared the way, pulled debris aside, and worked down into what had once been a basement. It took 40 minutes, but we found them, huddled beneath a collapsed beam, alive but barely conscious. Their faces were streaked with soot, lungs full of smoke, but they made it. As the medics worked, the mother looked up and saw Scout. "That dog," she whispered. "I saw him through the dust. I thought I was dreaming." Scout didn't acknowledge the praise. He just watched, still and calm, like his job wasn't finished yet. We got the family to safety. The captain walked over, pulled off his helmet. "I've seen a lot," he said. "But that was something else." I gave Scout a pat on the side. "He doesn't wait for orders. He just knows." We were on our way back when Scout started whining in the truck. Not barking. Whining. "You okay, bud?" I asked. He turned in his seat, nose pressed to the window. We weren't far from the edge of town when he let out a bark. Short, insistent. I pulled over. "All right, show me." He leapt from the cab and took off through a patch of tall grass toward an abandoned trailer park that had been closed for years. I followed, heart thudding. We found a boy, maybe 9 or 10, sitting on the steps of one of the old trailers, his arms wrapped around a skinny mutt. The boy looked up, startled, but didn't run. "Hey there," I said gently. "Everything okay?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You lost?" He nodded again. Scout walked up and sat beside the boy, gently licking his arm. The mutt wagged its tail nervously. "My name's Tom," I said. "And that's Scout. We're here to help." His name was Trevor. He'd run away from his foster home the night before. Said he didn't want to go to another one. Said nobody cared. "I care," I said, sitting beside him. "And so does he." Trevor looked at Scout. "He's really nice." "Yeah," I said. "He saved a lot of people. Even kids? Especially kids." Trevor came with us. I called the sheriff's office, and they reached out to social services. But before any decisions were made, Trevor had spent the entire afternoon at the station, sitting in the truck with Scout, brushing his fur, feeding him little bites of jerky. Scout never left his side. The officers who came to talk to Trevor saw it too. How calm he was. How focused. One of them asked if Scout had some kind of therapy training. I shook my head. He just knows what people need. A few weeks later, Trevor's caseworker asked if we'd bring Scout to his group home once a week. Just to visit. No pressure, just presence. We started going every Wednesday. Scout would make his rounds, sit with each kid, rest his head on their legs, let them talk if they wanted. Some did, some didn't. But they all smiled. The staff called it the best hour of the week. There was a rhythm now. Emergency calls, Scout alerts, weekly visits, newspaper stories, letters from strangers. Even a small feature on the local news titled "The Dog Who Saved a Town." Scout didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but he never let it change him. He still slept in the same spot on the porch, still waited by the door when I reached for my boots, still barked at squirrels in the backyard like it was the most important job on earth. But I noticed something else, too. He was slowing down again. Nothing dramatic, just a little more hesitation before jumping into the truck. A longer nap in the sun, a deeper sigh after a walk. I took him in for a checkup. Dr. Harris ran the tests twice. "He's healthy," she said. "But Tom, he's aging. His heart's strong, but his body's starting to feel it. He's done so much." I nodded. "I know. I'm not saying stop him, just listen to him. He'll tell you when he needs to rest." Scout kept working, but he also started choosing. He wouldn't join every call now, just the ones he felt mattered most. The crew respected that. Then came the flood. A freak thunderstorm dumped 8 inches of rain in 2 hours. The riverbanks swelled, roads vanished underwater, and half the town was without power. We worked around the clock. Scout stayed with the kids at the high school shelter. The first night, I found him curled up between 2 toddlers, their stuffed animals resting on his back. The next day, he helped us locate an elderly couple trapped in their car. He barked from a distance, loud and clear, until we followed his lead. On the 3rd day, the rain stopped, and Scout rested. He didn't move much, slept most of the day, ate very little, but when I looked into his eyes, I still saw the spark. I sat beside him on the floor that night, his head resting on my leg. "You know you don't have to prove anything anymore," I whispered. "You've already saved more people than I can count." He looked up at me, and for a moment I swear he smiled, but he wasn't done. I knew that. He was just waiting for the next time someone needed him. It was the quiet between storms that always made me uneasy. We'd had 3 solid weeks of peace. No fires, no gas leaks, no runaways or rescue calls. The sun hung high and dry in the sky every day, the kind of weather that made you think maybe, just maybe, things could stay calm for a while. But I knew better. Scout knew better, too. He spent more time sitting by the bay doors of the station lately, watching the road. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't even alert, not in the usual sense. He was waiting. That still, patient kind of waiting you see in old men who've seen too much and know it's never really over. I asked him once, half joking, "What are you looking for out there, partner?" He didn't move, just twitched one ear like maybe he knew the answer and wasn't ready to say. Then, right on schedule, the quiet ended. It started as a strange call from the construction site off Route 5. They were putting up a new assisted living center out past the cornfields. The foreman said his crew kept hearing noises, something banging under the ground, said tools were missing, equipment turned up in odd places. At first I figured it was animals or vandals, but then one of the workers disappeared. He'd gone to check on the far end of the site near the drainage tunnels and never came back. Search teams swept the area for 2 hours. Nothing. That's when they called us, and that's when Scout stood up without me saying a word, like he'd been waiting for the moment all along. We arrived just after dusk. The site was half-finished steel skeletons and stacks of concrete piping. A few work lights cast long shadows across the gravel. "His name's Micah," the foreman said, rubbing his neck. "Last we saw him, he had a flashlight and a radio. Both are gone too." Scout sniffed once, twice, then veered left without hesitation, heading toward the drainage trench. I followed, motioning for the others to stay back. The trench dropped off fast, 12 feet down to the concrete base, and there were fresh slide marks in the dirt. Someone had gone down there recently, Scout paced near the edge, whining now. I climbed down, flashlight in one hand, and found a boot print halfway along the pipe's rim. Then Scout barked, loud, sharp, 3 times. I followed the sound. It led me to a culvert tunnel partially blocked by a collapsed metal grate. I had to crawl to get through. The air was thick and damp, smelling of rust and old water. 10 feet in, I saw the light. Micah was there, slumped against the far wall, his radio crushed beside him. He was breathing, but barely. A twisted ankle. Mild concussion. Disoriented. He looked up and muttered, "I heard barking." Then a shadow. Then nothing. I didn't explain, just helped him up and got him out. Scout waited at the entrance, tail wagging slowly like he knew we'd come out just fine. After that, the town buzzed again. Scout the Wonder Dog. Miracle Mutt. The kid at the paper called him the Guardian of Franklin Hollow. But it wasn't about names for Scout. Never had been. The next call came from the school. Not an emergency this time, at least not the kind we were used to. One of the teachers had a son with autism. Quiet boy. Barely spoke. He'd seen Scout at the parade months back and hadn't stopped talking about him since. She asked if we might bring him by, we did. Scout walked into that classroom like he belonged there. The boy, Caleb, sat alone at a table, head down. Scout didn't approach right away, just sat near the door, watching. Then, slowly, he walked forward and lay down right at Caleb's feet. It took 20 minutes. Caleb reached out, touched Scout's fur, then whispered something too soft to hear. The teacher gasped and covered her mouth. "He spoke," she whispered to me. "He hasn't said anything in 3 months." Scout just closed his eyes and let the boy lean against him. We started getting more visits like that. Not emergencies, not danger, just need. Deep human need. Scout answered every time. An old man whose wife had passed after 50 years. He sat in his rocking chair and cried while Scout rested his head on his lap. A teenage boy who'd been caught stealing, angry and ashamed. Scout let him sit in silence for an hour, then nudged his hand until he smiled. A single father with twins who missed their mom. Scout played with them in the yard while the father watched from the porch, eyes full. The world had figured out who Scout was, even if it couldn't explain how he did what he did. One night, after a long day of visits, we sat on the porch together watching the sunset. The clouds were low and painted pink and gold across the horizon. Scout rested his chin on my boot. "You know," I said quietly, "you've done more for this town than any of us ever could." He didn't move. But I felt it, the soft nudge against my leg, the quiet agreement. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was from the governor's office. They wanted to honor Scout at a statewide ceremony. Medal, proclamation, the whole deal. I read it twice before folding it into my pocket. Scout didn't need medals, he needed people. And he had plenty of those already. I talked to the crew about it. Charlie said, "If you take him, we're all going. This is his family too." So, we planned the trip, rented a van, booked a motel near the Capitol. Scout would be the guest of honor at a ceremony for emergency responders. The morning we left, the whole town lined the street. Kids waved signs. The bakery sent a bag of cookies shaped like fire hydrants. One little girl held a hand-painted banner that read, "Scout saved my grandpa." He rode shotgun the whole way, looking out the window, tail tapping against the seat. At the ceremony, they read off his list of heroics: fires, rescues, recoveries, comfort visits, lives touched. People saved. The applause was loud. The medals shiny. The cameras everywhere. But Scout didn't care. After the ceremony, he walked over to a group of kids sitting cross-legged on the grass and lay down in the middle of them, tail swishing. They all reached out to pet him at once, and he soaked it in with his usual quiet grace. That night, back at the motel, I sat on the floor beside his bed. "You don't even know what you did, do you?" I asked. He blinked once, then closed his eyes, breathing slow and deep. The trip home was quiet. Scout slept most of the way, head in my lap. The medal sat on the dashboard. We never did hang it up. There was still work to do. Still people who needed him. And I knew deep down, Scout wasn't finished. He was still waiting, still watching, still ready for the next call that would change everything again. The morning after we got back from the Capitol, I opened the front door and found a line of people waiting on the sidewalk. They weren't reporters. They weren't fans. They were neighbors, folks from Franklin Hollow and a few from out of town, standing in the chill with coffee cups in hand and dogs on leashes. They weren't there for autographs or photos. They just wanted to thank Scout, and they wanted him to meet their pets. Scout stepped out beside me, tail already wagging. He greeted every dog like an old friend, sniffs, nudges, a few play bows here and there. The people smiled and stayed quiet, like they understood the sacredness of what they were part of. We must have stayed out there for an hour. After that, it became a weekly thing. Saturday mornings, Scout would sit in the front yard like a mayor holding open office. People came by in a slow, steady stream. Kids, parents, elderly couples. Some brought coffee. Others brought treats. A few just sat on the curb to watch Scout do his thing. I built a little bench for him under the tree, painted it red, same shade as the station truck, and nailed a small sign to it, Scout's Corner. He used it every day. One afternoon, I found a letter tucked under the bench. No return address. Just a folded sheet of lined paper. It said, "I was going to end my life last year. Then I saw Scout sitting with a boy on the curb. The way he was still and patient, that stopped me. I watched him for 10 minutes and cried for the first time in months, thank you. He saved me." I kept that letter, put it in the same box where I stored newspaper clippings and photos. That week, we got a visit from the local elementary school. A teacher asked if Scout could help with a new program they were piloting, teaching kids about emergency safety and emotional support. We showed up the next day. Scout walked into the gym like he was leading a parade. The kids exploded with excitement, but when Scout sat down, the room quieted on its own. He had that effect. The teacher gave a short talk about fire safety. I demonstrated how to use a blanket to smother a stovetop fire. Scout demonstrated nothing. He just sat there, tail thumping, until a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Does Scout get scared?" she asked. I knelt beside him. "Sure, everyone does. But Scout knows the trick isn't to not be scared. It's to move anyway. Right, buddy?" Scout licked my hand. That was the beginning of our visits to the school. Every other Friday, we'd spend an hour there. The kids made Scout his own badge out of glitter and pipe cleaners. He wore it proudly on his collar. Around that time, a new guy joined the crew at the station. Fresh from the academy, bright-eyed, and way too eager. His name was Nolan. First thing he did was kneel down and try to shake Scout's paw. Scout didn't budge. "Uh-oh," Nolan said, laughing. "Did I blow it already?" "Give him time," I said. "He decides when it counts." 2 weeks later, Nolan proved himself in a warehouse fire. Pulled me out when a ceiling beam collapsed. Sprained his shoulder doing it. The next morning, Scout walked up to him at the station, sat down, and laid his head on Nolan's knee. Nolan cried. From that point on, they were thick as thieves. Scout followed him around the engine bay, curled up under his bunk at night, and even let him scratch that impossible spot behind his ear that no one else had found. We didn't talk about it much, but the guys at the station all agreed. Scout could sense something in people that went deeper than instinct. He didn't pick favorites. He picked hearts. And when he picked you, that meant something. One night, after a brutal rescue in a flooded tunnel, I sat on the floor of the station locker room, drenched and shivering. We'd pulled out a teenager who'd fallen through a drainage grate. It took 2 hours in chest-high water and 0 visibility. I was wrecked. Scout walked in, soaked too, fur clumped and dripping. He didn't sit beside me. He didn't lick my face. He just stood there, one paw resting on my boot, still, quiet, present. It was enough. And still, with all the rescues, all the visits, all the moments of quiet comfort, Scout remained humble. He didn't seek attention. He didn't need it. He just wanted to help. Then came the quarry collapse. An old rock quarry 3 towns over had reopened for landscaping stone. On a Tuesday morning, part of the upper wall gave way and buried a delivery truck under tons of rubble. The driver was unaccounted for. They called us in, not for manpower, but for Scout. We arrived just after noon. The wind was fierce, carrying dust across the broken ground. The rescue teams had already cleared a few pathways into the rubble, but no sign of the driver. Scout leapt down from the truck, nose twitching, eyes sharp. I unclipped his harness. "Find him." He moved fast, sniffing, circling, ignoring the noise and the shouting. 5 minutes in, he stopped. Barked once, then twice. We followed. He'd led us to a patch of stone that didn't look any different from the rest. "He's sure?" one of the quarry workers asked. I nodded. "Always." The crew got to work. After nearly an hour of digging, they found him. Pinned, unconscious, but alive. Scout stood back, watching, ears low. "He wasn't barking for help," I said later. "He was telling us where to dig." That story made the papers, too. Another miracle, another line added to Scout's legacy. But back home, Scout was still just Scout. He slept in the same corner of the firehouse, ate from the same chipped bowl, watched the wind from the same porch, and sometimes when the moon was high and the roads were quiet, he'd get up and walk the perimeter of the station, checking doors, sniffing corners, watching. One night, I followed him, just to see. He stopped by the back gate, sat down, and stared into the trees. The woods were calm. No noise, no movement. I sat beside him. "What are you looking for, Scout?" He didn't answer, just leaned against my side. I didn't press. I just sat with him until the sun came up. Because whatever he saw, or whatever he was waiting for, I knew we'd face it together. We always did. The first time I noticed Scout struggling with the stairs, it caught me off guard. It was a Thursday morning, and we were getting ready for a school visit. I was halfway down the front porch steps when I heard him behind me, pausing. Not because of a sound or scent, just hesitating. I turned around and saw him testing his weight on his back legs, then slowly descending one step at a time, careful like a dog who hadn't always had to think about such things. I didn't say anything, just waited. We made it to the truck together. At the school, he was his usual self, calm, patient, attentive. He sat through story time with the kindergartners, wagged his tail as they read aloud in clumsy, proud voices. One girl, who was new and hadn't spoken all week, whispered Scout's name when she touched his ear. The teacher's eyes went wide. "You saw that?" she asked me afterward. "I did," I said. "Scout saw her first." That was his way. He found the quiet ones, the ones who needed something without knowing how to ask. Later that evening, back at the station, I stayed behind after the others went home. Scout rested beside my locker, his breathing even but heavy. I took out my notebook, the one I'd been keeping since the day he came into my life, and jotted down a few things. The girl's name, the look on her face, the sound of her whisper. Then I flipped back and reread a few entries. Rescues, yes, but also moments, little pieces of humanity he had restored just by showing up. I closed the notebook and glanced at Scout. "You've done more good in a year than most of us manage in a lifetime," I said. His eyes opened halfway. Tail gave a soft thump. A few days later, we responded to a fire out near the rail yard. Abandoned warehouse. It was supposed to be empty, but the wind was wrong, and smoke poured into the adjacent lot. By the time we got there, 2 transients had already made it out, coughing and stumbling. They said someone else was still inside. Scout didn't wait. He darted toward the side entrance, the one with the rusted metal door hanging off its hinges. I followed close behind. The smoke inside was thick, but we were used to that. Scout moved low and fast, weaving between fallen beams and splintered crates. He stopped near a collapsed shelf, barked twice. I dropped to my knees, scanned the shadows, and spotted him. A man in his 50s, lying face down. Alive, but barely. We pulled him out together. Paramedics took over. One of them shook his head and muttered, "Wouldn't have lasted 5 more minutes." Scout sat beside the man's stretcher, watching quietly. The paper ran the story that weekend, called Scout, the Relentless Rescuer. People loved the headline, but I knew better. It wasn't about being relentless. It was about knowing when someone still had a chance. That same week, Scout started limping. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. I took him to Dr. Harris. She ran more tests. This time she didn't smile when she came back into the room. "Tom," she said gently, "he's not in pain, but his joints are aging faster than expected. The work he's done, the physical strain, he needs real rest." I swallowed hard. "What are we talking about? Limited duty?" She shook her head. "No duty. No more fires, no long walks. Controlled movement, quality time. He's earned it." She gave me supplements, a new diet plan, exercises for his muscles. Said we'd check in monthly. I nodded through it all, heart heavier than I let on. Back home, I unrolled a new rug in the living room, bought a lower bed for him, moved his bowls closer. Little things. And he adjusted. No protests. No frustration. Just Scout being Scout. Adaptable, steady. But his eyes still followed every engine that left the bay. His ears still twitched when the siren went off. So I started bringing the world to him. School kids came to visit at the station instead of us going there. We turned the back lot into a little reading corner. Blankets, beanbags, and books. Scout's Corner, version 2. Veterans from the local support group stopped by with folding chairs and stories. Scout lay among them like one of the guys, tail brushing against their boots. Even Trevor, the boy from the trailer park, came back every weekend. He was taller now, surer of himself. Scout greeted him the same way every time, with a gentle head bump and a thump of his tail. One afternoon, Trevor brought a new kid with him. Another foster placement, quiet and wary. Scout didn't rush him, just lay nearby, eyes soft. An hour passed. Then the boy scooted closer. By the time they left, the boy had whispered a single word. Bye. To Scout, that was enough. Spring turned to summer. The town grew warmer, louder. Tourists passed through. Local businesses flourished. But at the center of it all, Scout remained steady. Watching. Waiting. One evening, we had a cookout at the firehouse. Just the crew, their families, some folks from town. Scout lay on his bench, tail flicking with each new laugh. Jake came over with his son, who was 4 and obsessed with fire trucks. He knelt beside Scout. "You're still the boss around here, huh?" Scout rolled to his side for a belly rub. "Jake," I said, "we should frame that badge the kids made for him. Hang it by the front desk." He grinned. "Already ahead of you." That night, after everyone left, I sat with Scout under the stars. Crickets chirped. A warm breeze passed through the trees. "You good, buddy?" I asked. He blinked, slow, peaceful. I leaned back against the porch rail. "I think you've done more for this town than anyone since the founder himself." He yawned. I smiled. The thing about heroes is they don't always know when to stop. But Scout? He understood something deeper. That service wasn't just about the job. It was about presence. About being there when no one else knew what to do. And even now, in his quieter moments, he was still showing up, still leading, still reminding all of us what it meant to be brave, not just in action, but in rest. And I knew, whatever came next, Scout would face it the same way he always had. One step at a time, steady, faithful, unshaken. I woke up that morning before the alarm. The sky was still dark outside the window, not even a whisper of light peeking through the trees yet. Scout lay curled up beside the bed, breathing steady and slow, his chest rising and falling in that familiar rhythm I'd come to trust more than anything else in this world. I stayed there for a while, just watching him. Something in the air told me the day would be different. Not in a bad way. Not ominous. Just heavier. More important. Scout stirred as I stood and slipped on my boots. He opened one eye, then the other, and pushed himself up slowly. No bark, no whine, just a quiet nod of recognition. I patted his side, and we walked together to the porch. He stepped down the stairs with that same careful motion he'd used these last few months, one paw at a time. It was still too early for traffic or bird song, but the town was there, silent, resting. Scout sat on the bench. I stood beside him. We didn't need to talk. We never did. By breakfast, the crew had started arriving at the station. Nolan brought a box of donuts and 2 coffees, handed one to me with a grin. "Scout get his morning scratch yet?" he asked. I nodded. "He's been up since before the sun." Nolan crouched down beside him. "You ready for the big day, old boy?" Scout blinked slowly and leaned into his hand. Word had spread that today would be Scout's last official day at the station. We weren't calling it a retirement party because that didn't feel right. It was more of a celebration, an acknowledgement of the years he'd given, the lives he'd touched. The mayor showed up mid-morning, along with a few council members and half the school from down the street. Kids poured off buses holding hand-drawn signs. One read, "Scout saved my uncle." Another said, "Our town's bravest." Scout stood in the middle of the firehouse bay and took it all in with quiet dignity. No jumping, no barking, just tail wags and soft looks, the same way he always carried himself. Dozens of people filtered through, and he met each one with patience. We had banners strung from the rafters. Someone brought in a cake shaped like a fire hydrant. The local reporter asked to interview me, and I kept it short. He didn't just save people from fires, he saved people from themselves. By noon, the sun had climbed high. Scout was back on his bench, surrounded by kids reading stories to him in small groups. He lay still, ears flicking with every new voice, tail gently swishing. After lunch, Dr. Harris arrived. She knelt beside him, checked his joints, listened to his breathing. "He's good," she said quietly to me. "Tired, but peaceful." The afternoon carried a calm with it, even with the foot traffic, a calm that Scout had earned. Around 3, I took him for one last walk through the station. We passed the locker room, the gear wall, the engine bay. He paused at each spot, almost like he was checking to make sure it was all still there. I opened the side door and let him step into the back lot where we used to play fetch in the early days. He walked a slow circle, then lay down under the tree. I sat next to him. Just us again. "You did it, Scout," I whispered. "You gave this town more than it ever expected." He looked at me, those familiar eyes steady, deep, and kind. We stayed there until the sun began to lower, painting the sky gold and pink. That evening, as the visitors trickled away and the firehouse grew quiet, Scout curled up by the front doors. He always liked to be near them. Ready. Nolan laid down a blanket for him. Jake brought over his favorite chew toy, even though he rarely used it anymore. I filled his water bowl and sat with him until the sky darkened completely. The last call of the night came in at 8:47. Small brush fire near the edge of town. Contained fast. The crew handled it without me. I stayed back with Scout. He rested his head on my boot again. I didn't move. Around 10, the others said their goodnights. Jake squeezed my shoulder. Charlie nodded. Nolan knelt and whispered something to Scout before leaving. It was just us again. The firehouse lights dimmed. The stars were clear overhead. I could hear Scout's breathing. Slower now. Gentle. His eyes were closed. His tail was still. I stroked his side, felt the warmth of him, the comfort he'd given so freely to everyone else. "You can rest now," I whispered. "You gave us everything." A few minutes passed, then a few more. And then, in the most peaceful way I could have ever hoped for, Scout took one last deep breath and let it out. He didn't move again. I sat there for a long time. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves on the tree where he once chased squirrels. Somewhere down the road, a siren wailed softly and then faded. The station lights hummed low. I stood up and looked around the bay. For the first time in years, there was no tail thumping against the bench, no quiet paws pacing the floor, no soft bark in the dark. But his presence, it hadn't left. It was in the badge hanging on the wall, in the stories we'd keep telling, in the kids who learned courage from a golden retriever with a quiet soul, in the lives still moving forward because he had once stood still beside them. Scout was gone. But the hope he brought with him, that remained, and it always would.